What is meant by the phrase manifest destiny? We can start to understand that phrase by looking at the writings of John O'Sullivan, a newspaper editor in the July 1845 issue of the Democratic Review. He wrote about the following quote: "The far-reaching, the boundless future will be the era of American greatness. In its magnificent domain of space and time, the nation of many nations is destined to manifest to mankind the excellence of divine principles." So, what exactly is O'Sullivan saying? O'Sullivan implied that America is destined by God to spread coast to coast, so from the Atlantic Ocean to the Pacific Ocean. This was accomplished in several ways. One, wars with the natives. Two, stealing land from natives, and also confining natives to reservations. As the U.S. acquired more land, conflicts became inevitable. Settlers seemingly always had a desire to move west, even when it was illegal to do so. An example would be the Proclamation of 1763, which was an attempt to minimize the contact between settlers and natives by making it illegal to move west of the Appalachian Mountains. However, many settlers already did that. If they hadn't already, they continued to do so. Inevitably, these two groups were to clash, and these wars, the Indian Wars as they're called by history, I'll use the term Native American here. These wars lasted from the 17th to the early 20th century, with the last of these minor skirmishes happening in 1924. I learned in school that the end of this period was in 1890 with the Wounded Knee Massacre in South Dakota. But there were other minor skirmishes until well into the 20th century. Conflicts between natives and colonists happened almost as soon as these colonists from Europe arrived. It is important to note that some tribes and colonists did get along, so not all tribes fought with the settlers. This is evidenced, for example, in the Revolutionary War. You had tribes on both sides of the conflict, for the British and then for the colonists as well. Why were settlers moving west? Well, it's because of rapid population growth in the cities on the East Coast at the end of at the beginning of the country. And this necessitated a bunch of land acquisitions during the early 19th century. These included the Louisiana Purchase, which expanded the U.S. to the Mississippi River, the purchase of Florida, the annexation of Texas, and then the agreement with Britain on Oregon. Also, the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo was signed after the Mexican-American War, and that added 525,000 square miles to what the United States was at that time. So basically to the Mississippi River. And that treaty allowed the U.S. to purchase what is now California. Lastly, the Gadsden Purchase in 1853 completed the modern borders of the U.S. by allowing the U.S. to take control of the southern portions of what would become Arizona and New Mexico. Now, with these land acquisitions, these lands were being stolen from the Native Americans, and the government had to find a way to deal with the natives. These conflicts, as I've said, often resulted in natives losing their land. Wars with tribes were used to justify confiscating their land. Treaties were signed with various Native American groups, and in the case of some tribes, they were tricked into signing treaties whether it be uh, translation errors by missionaries or whoever drove the treaties, or just in general. The government also tried to force Native Americans to adopt European customs in what is called forced assimilation, so trying to force Native Americans to give up their way of life and become Americanized. This means giving up their ways of life, farming for, or actually hunting and foraging for farming, and then also boarding schools were established. I made several videos about boarding schools, so go ahead and check those out. I'll link them in the corner and in the description. And these efforts to take land and force Native Americans to assimilate led natives to be confined to reservations. The government devised the reservation system to control natives, and this process started with the Indian Removal Act in 1830 by Andrew Jackson. This moved natives west of the Mississippi River. You may have heard of the Trail of Tears, where thousands of Native Americans died on their march to Indian Territory in what is now Oklahoma. And that was as a result of the Indian Removal Act. Now, the reservation system itself was set up in 1851 with the Indian Reorganization Act, and there were funds to help this system as well. Now that tribes were confined to their own reservations, over time, the concept of tribal sovereignty came about, which means that tribes' reservations are their own sovereign nations within the United States. So they're not subject to certain U.S. laws. And these reservations are under control of the Bureau of Indian Affairs. There are also many unintended consequences as a result of this slow move to reservations as a result of Manifest Destiny, including lots of poverty, low income level, starvation, and the list could go on and on. In conclusion, Manifest Destiny created many problems whose consequences are still felt by natives to this day. I hope you enjoyed this video. Please feel free to give it a like. In the comments, go ahead and comment on what other historical topics you would like me to make videos about in the future.